You've heard of Cinco de Mayo. Maybe you think it's just about tacos, tequila, and a Mexican battle most Americans barely remember. But what if I told you that without Cinco de Mayo, the United States might not have survived the Civil War? That a single day in a small Mexican town disrupted a European empire, delayed a global power grab, and helped prevent the Confederacy from gaining an international ally. This isn't just a Mexican holiday, it's one of the most overlooked turning points in American history. Cinco de Mayo, often mistaken for Mexico's Independence Day, has become a widely celebrated holiday in the United States, known for its vibrant parades, colorful folkloric performances, and Mexican-themed festivities. But beyond the modern celebrations of food, music, and dance, Cinco de Mayo holds a deeper, far more complex story that intertwines with a pivotal moment in United States history, the Civil War. What seems today like a localized Mexican victory had far-reaching consequences, shaping the trajectory of democracy and sovereignty in North America during the 1860s. To understand the true significance of Cinco de Mayo, we must first travel back to mid-19th century Mexico, a country weakened by decades of internal strife. In 1861, the Mexican government, led by President Benito Juárez, was financially crippled after years of civil war and foreign interventions. In response to the mounting national debt, Juárez issued a moratorium suspending foreign debt payments for 2 years. This angered European powers, particularly France, Britain, and Spain, which had lent Mexico substantial sums. While Britain and Spain eventually reached agreements and withdrew their forces diplomatically, France had other ambitions. Under Emperor Napoleon III, France envisioned expanding its global empire, and Mexico was seen as a strategic target. Not only would a French-controlled Mexico provide access to valuable resources and trade routes, but it could also serve as a staging ground for broader influence in the Americas. But there was another layer to this ambition, one connected directly to the United States. At that very point in history, the United States was in the midst of one of the darkest and most defining periods of its existence, the Civil War. The conflict had erupted in 1861 when a group of southern states, deeply invested in the institution of slavery and fiercely protective of what they viewed as their sovereign rights, made the unprecedented decision to secede from the Union. These states formed a separate government known as the Confederate States of America. Their leaders believed that the federal government, under the leadership of newly elected President Abraham Lincoln, posed a direct threat to their way of life, especially the economic and social order built on slave labor. For President Lincoln, the secession represented more than just a political rebellion. It was an existential threat to the very idea of the United States as a unified republic. The country had been founded on principles of union and liberty, and the idea that states could simply break away threatened to unravel everything the founding fathers had fought to build. Lincoln, though cautious in his early rhetoric about slavery, understood that the preservation of the Union was inseparable from the moral question of human bondage. As the war unfolded, he would come to embrace the abolition of slavery not just as a strategic necessity, but as a moral imperative. By 1862, the Civil War was escalating into a full-scale national catastrophe. Battles such as Bull Run, Antietam, and Shiloh shocked the nation with their unprecedented scale of violence. Tens of thousands of soldiers lay dead or wounded. The economy was strained, families were torn apart, and the political future of the country hung in the balance. The federal government's attention was almost entirely consumed by the war effort, with resources, troops, and leadership all focused on restoring the Union and defeating the Confederacy. It was during this period of American vulnerability that Napoleon III of France saw a rare and golden opportunity. The United States had long maintained a strong opposition to European colonial ambitions in the Western Hemisphere, famously codified in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. That doctrine had asserted that any attempt by European powers to interfere in the affairs of the Americas would be viewed as an act of aggression requiring U.S. intervention. But now, with the U.S. government fighting for its survival, the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine seemed, at least temporarily, suspended. Napoleon III, an ambitious ruler with imperial dreams, concluded that this was the perfect moment to test America's resolve or lack thereof. He calculated that the U.S. would be too distracted and too weak to respond to foreign intervention in Mexico. He believed he could expand France's influence into the Americas, establish a monarchy in Mexico aligned with French interests, and potentially use it as a base of support for the Confederate cause. In Napoleon's eyes, the fractured and embattled United States posed little obstacle to his larger vision, the revival of French prestige through a new empire in the New World. This moment marked the convergence of two massive historical narratives: Mexico's fight for sovereignty and the United States' struggle to survive as a single nation. The actions that would unfold from Napoleon's decision to intervene in Mexico would ripple far beyond the borders of either country. They would challenge the assumptions of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, place new strains on U.S. foreign policy during wartime, and ultimately shape the very outcomes of both the Civil War and the future of democracy in the Americas. Napoleon's gamble was bold: establish a French puppet monarchy in Mexico and use it to support Confederate ambitions in the U.S. The Confederacy's survival depended in part on foreign recognition and support. If France succeeded in setting up a pro-slavery regime in Mexico, it might tip the balance in favor of the Confederacy by breaking the Union's diplomatic isolation. France had already shown interest in Southern cotton, and a French-backed Mexican monarchy could provide critical supplies and a potential military alliance. Thus, the conflict in Mexico was not merely about debt, it was a clash of ideologies and strategic interests, with the future of democracy hanging in the balance. On May 5, 1862, the Mexican army, led by General Ignacio Zaragoza, confronted the French at the town of Puebla. Outnumbered, outgunned, and undertrained, the Mexican force numbered roughly 4,000 men, many of whom were indigenous and local volunteers. Facing them was a professional French army of 6,500 soldiers, veterans of European campaigns and equipped with modern weaponry. The odds were heavily in favor of France, but against expectations, the Mexican defenders held their ground. Taking advantage of the hilly terrain and fortified positions, they launched a fierce resistance that repelled the French assaults throughout the day. By nightfall, the French forces were forced to retreat, suffering heavy casualties. The victory at Puebla was not strategically decisive in the long term. France would return with greater force and eventually install Archduke Maximilian of Austria as Emperor of Mexico. But the psychological and political impact of the battle was immense. The victory electrified Mexican morale and proved that imperial powers could be resisted. More importantly, it bought time. The delay in France's military campaign disrupted its plans to establish a strong foothold in Mexico, which was critical to influencing the Civil War in the United States. With the French campaign slowed and ultimately extended far beyond Napoleon's expectations, the Union gained a crucial window of opportunity. By 1863, the tide of the Civil War began turning in favor of the Union. Key victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg boosted Northern morale, and foreign powers, including France, became increasingly reluctant to overtly support the Confederacy. Napoleon III, realizing that the North might win, began to distance himself from Confederate diplomacy. Moreover, the Union, once stabilized, turned its attention back to foreign affairs. Lincoln's administration, through diplomatic channels, made it clear that the U.S. would not tolerate a French empire on its doorstep. Ironically, the legacy of Cinco de Mayo is more vibrant in the United States than in Mexico, while the city of Puebla continues to commemorate the battle with military parades and reenactments. The rest of Mexico treats it as a relatively minor holiday. In contrast, Cinco de Mayo in the U.S. has evolved into a widespread celebration of Mexican culture, particularly in states with large Mexican-American populations like California and Texas. The holiday gained popularity in the 20th century as part of a broader effort to celebrate and preserve Hispanic heritage. During the Chicana movement of the 1960s and 70s, activists highlighted Cinco de Mayo as a symbol of resistance against oppression, linking the Battle of Puebla to modern struggles for civil rights and identity. The holiday became a source of cultural pride. a day to honor the resilience and contributions of Mexican Americans. Over time, the commercial appeal of Cinco de Mayo grew, with businesses promoting the day through themed events and marketing campaigns. But while the party atmosphere is hard to miss, the historical roots of the day are often forgotten. Revisiting the deeper context of Cinco de Mayo offers a richer understanding of the intertwined destinies of Mexico and the United States. Two nations, facing internal and external threats, found their fates linked in unexpected ways. The courage of outnumbered Mexican soldiers at Puebla not only inspired their countrymen, but also played a crucial, though indirect, role in safeguarding American democracy. It is a story of defiance in the face of overwhelming power, of small acts that ripple across borders, and of how history's course can turn on the resolve of those least expected to triumph. As we reflect on Cinco de Mayo today, it's worth moving beyond the surface-level celebrations. Behind every pipada, every folklorico dance, and every taco stand lies a story of resistance, sovereignty, and geopolitical chess. The Battle of Puebla was never just a regional skirmish, it was a battle that reverberated across an entire continent, shaping the fate of nations and altering the direction of history. The next time you raise a glass on May 5th, remember not just the music and joy, but also the courage and strategy that made it possible. In the grand tapestry of history, it's easy to overlook the small threads that hold everything together. Cinco de Mayo is often dismissed as a minor holiday or mistaken for Mexico's Independence Day, but in truth, it marks a moment when a small and a resourced army stood in defiance of one of the greatest imperial powers of its time and won. That victory did more than lift Mexican spirits. It bought time, it disrupted imperial strategy, and it may have helped preserve the fragile future of a divided United States. Had the French succeeded swiftly in Mexico, their empire might have extended across the southern border of the US, lending legitimacy and perhaps support to the Confederacy. But they didn't, because at Puebla, ordinary people stood their ground. They didn't just fight for their country, they inadvertently altered the course of history across an entire continent. So the next time you see Cinco de Mayo celebrated with music, food, and festivities, remember what truly happened on that day in 1862. Remember that it was more than a battle, it was a stand for sovereignty, freedom, and resistance against tyranny. A moment when Mexico, under siege and outnumbered, made a choice that helped preserve democracy not just for itself, but for its neighbor in the north as well. Because sometimes, the fate of nations doesn't turn on massive armies or grand decorations, but on a single day, in a single place, where people decide to resist,